Alexandria baked under the relentless Mediterranean sun, a city sculpted from ambition and intellect. White limestone buildings shimmered, reflecting heat onto bustling streets where languages collided like waves in the harbor. Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, tongues from India and beyond. Canals, engineered with precise geometry, cut through the urban sprawl, feeding fountains and carrying the vital pulse of fresh water. Grand colonnades offered shaded walkways, lined with statues of philosophers long dust and emperors still breathing. The air hung thick with the scent of salt, spices, incense, and the faint, persistent tang of papyrus and parchment. At the heart of this metropolis, both physically and spiritually, stood the Serapeum, the daughter library and temple complex, a beacon of the city's, and arguably the ancient world's, most audacious project, the Great Library and its scholarly sibling, the Mausoleum. Though the original library within the royal palaces was a faded, perhaps even destroyed, memory by the late 4th century AD, its spirit, its raison d'etre, lived on fiercely within the Serapeum. This wasn't merely a repository of scrolls, though its shelves groaned under the weight of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Treatises on geometry from Euclid, the celestial maps of Ptolemy, the medical wisdom of Herophilus, the philosophical dialogues of Plato and Aristotle, histories, dramas, epic poems, works on mechanics, hydraulics, and astronomy from across the known world. The Serapeum was a living organism. It pulsed with the quiet intensity of focused minds. Scholars, known as philologoi or simply the learned, moved through its halls and courtyards with a purposeful air. They debated metaphysics under the shade of date palms in the inner courtyards, argued mathematical proofs on wax tablets in quiet alcoves, or meticulously copied fragile texts in dedicated scriptoria, the scratch of reed pens on papyrus a constant, reassuring hum. Astronomy was charted from its terraces. Mechanics experimented with in its workshops. It was a sanctuary dedicated to logos, reason, word, the underlying order of the universe sought through observation, deduction, and rigorous discourse. Here, the divine was approached not solely through blind faith, but through the intricate beauty of mathematics and the disciplined pursuit of understanding nature's laws. The presiding deity, Serapis, a syncretic fusion of Greek and Egyptian gods, embodied this ideal, a god of healing, the afterlife, and the sun, whose orderly path across the sky was a testament to cosmic rationality. Into this world, vibrant yet increasingly strained by the tremors of a changing empire, Hypatia was born around 355 AD. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a luminary of the Mausoleum, a mathematician and astronomer of considerable renown, a guardian of the intellectual flame. Theon was not merely a scholar, he was a curator of the past, meticulously editing and commenting on the works of Euclid and Ptolemy, ensuring their survival and accessibility for future generations. His house, likely nestled in the Bruchian district near the harbour and the intellectual heart, was not a typical domestic space. It was an extension of the scholarly world. Scrolls were not decorations. They were tools, companions, the very fabric of existence. Instruments for observing the heavens, astrolabes, armillary spheres, shared space with geometric models and diagrams scratched onto tablets. Conversation revolved around theorems, celestial mechanics, the latest philosophical treatise from Athens or Constantinople, not just marketplace gossip or domestic affairs. Theon, defying the prevailing norms that largely confined female education to the domestic arts or religious instruction, saw in his daughter not a future wife to be married off, but a mind to be cultivated. From her earliest years, Hypatia was immersed in this rarefied atmosphere. She learned her letters not just on simple tablets, but tracing the elegant Greek of mathematical proofs. Geometry wasn't an abstract subject. It was the language of the universe, made tangible with compass and straightedge on sand trays. The rhythmic movement of the planets wasn't myth. It was calculable, predictable, governed by the elegant laws her father taught her to discern. She absorbed the disciplined thinking, the relentless questioning, the profound respect for evidence and logical argument that were the hallmarks of the Alexandrian intellectual tradition. The library and Mausian weren't just buildings she visited. They were the air she breathed, the landscape of her developing consciousness. She grew up understanding that knowledge was a sacred pursuit, a bulwark against ignorance and superstition, and that the serene halls of the Serapeum were the closest humanity could come to touching the divine mind through reason. Yet, even as Hypatia mastered Euclid under Theon's exacting gaze, the streets outside whispered of a different kind of fervor, a fervor that viewed the serene pursuit of reason within the Serapeum not as sacred, but as suspect, even dangerous. The harmonious world of logos she was inheriting existed on an increasingly precarious island. Hypatia's education under Theon was rigorous, systematic, and devoid of the boundaries typically imposed on women of her time. He treated her intellect with the same seriousness he would a promising male student destined for the Mausian. Their days followed a rhythm dictated by study. Mornings might be dedicated to advanced geometry, dissecting Euclid's elements beyond the basics, exploring conic sections, parabolas, ellipses, hyperbolas, curves that describe celestial orbits and the paths of projectiles. Theon, a master commentator, wouldn't just present the proofs. He would challenge her to reconstruct them, to find alternative pathways, to question the underlying assumptions. Afternoons could be consumed by the intricate celestial mechanics of Ptolemy's Almagest. Hypatia learned to calculate planetary positions, to understand the complex system of epicycles and deferents Ptolemy used to model the movements of the heavens, her fingers tracing paths on brass armillary spheres that replicated the cosmos in miniature. She grasped the mathematics behind predicting eclipses, the solstices, the rising of the dog star, Sirius, knowledge that was both practically useful for calendars and navigation, and deeply philosophical, revealing the clockwork precision of the universe. Astronomy bled naturally into mathematics. Hypatia delved into number theory, the properties of integers that fascinated Pythagoreans and Platonists alike. She explored the elegance of Diophantine equations, seeking integer solutions, a pursuit requiring both algebraic ingenuity and patient persistence. Practical mechanics, the application of mathematical principles to physical devices, was also part of her curriculum. She understood the theory behind levers, pulleys, siphons, and water clocks, the very devices that animated Alexandria's sophisticated infrastructure and filled the workshops near the Serapeum. Theon ensured her knowledge wasn't merely theoretical. She could likely design, or at least comprehend the design of, complex instruments. But Theon's gift to his daughter extended beyond mathematics and astronomy. He instilled in her the broader framework of Hellenic paideia, the comprehensive education that formed the cultivated individual. She studied philosophy deeply, becoming particularly steeped in the Neoplatonism that dominated late antique intellectual life. Under tutors likely associated with the Mausian, she absorbed the teachings of Plotinus and his successors, particularly Porphyry and Iamblichus. Neoplatonism offered a grand, hierarchical vision of reality. It taught that all existence emanated from the One, an ineffable, ultimate principle of unity and goodness. From the One flowed divine mind, nous, which contained the perfect forms or ideas, and then the world soul, which animated the material cosmos. The human soul, a spark of the divine, was trapped in the physical body, its highest purpose being to purify itself through intellectual and moral discipline, to ascend through contemplation back towards union with the One. For Hypatia, this philosophy wasn't dry abstraction. It provided a profound spiritual and ethical context for her scientific pursuits. Studying the orderly movements of the planets wasn't just calculation. It was contemplating the visible manifestation of divine mind. Solving a geometric proof wasn't just mental gymnastics. It was participating in the eternal, perfect realm of forms. Mathematics became a form of meditation, a path to purify the soul by engaging with pure, unchanging truth. It offered a powerful antidote to the materialism and growing religious sectarianism she observed in the city. Neoplatonism emphasized reason, virtue, self-mastery, and the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity. It taught tolerance, seeing different religions as imperfect reflections of the same ultimate truths, accessible to the purified intellect. This philosophical grounding shaped Hypatia's character. It fostered a disciplined mind, a calm demeanor, a focus on inner virtue over external circumstance, and a profound sense of intellectual and spiritual purpose. She learned to articulate complex ideas with clarity and precision, a skill honed through constant dialectic, the rigorous question and answer method central to philosophical training. By her late teens and early 20s, Hypatia wasn't just Theon's daughter. She was a formidable scholar in her own right, mastering the intricate languages of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She began assisting Theon in his work, perhaps helping with his commentaries on Ptolemy or Euclid, her own insights enriching his scholarship. The quiet courtyards and lecture halls of the Serapeum became her natural habitat. She was no longer merely a student within its walls. She was becoming a recognized part of its living intellectual tradition, a vessel carrying the accumulated wisdom of centuries forward. The torch was being passed, but the winds outside the sanctuary walls were growing stronger, colder. As Hypatia's mastery deepened, her presence within the Serapeum evolved from diligent student to active participant. She began assisting Theon not just with calculations or transcriptions, but with conceptual clarity in his commentaries, her insights sharpening his arguments. Gradually, word spread through Alexandria's scholarly circles. Theon's daughter possessed not merely inherited knowledge, but a formidable, original intellect. Students drawn by her father's reputation began noticing the young woman who could unravel complex geometrical dilemmas or explain Ptolemy's epicycles with startling lucidity. When Theon, perhaps sensing the changing tides or simply acknowledging her readiness, formally entrusted her with teaching introductory courses, it felt less like an appointment and more like a natural emergence. Her lectures, initially held in smaller annexes of the Serapeum, quickly became renowned. Hypatia possessed a rare gift, the ability to make the abstract tangible. She didn't just recite Euclid, she demonstrated harmony with compass and rule, showing how lines and angles revealed universal truths. She didn't merely chart the stars, she used the brasso-military sphere to illustrate the celestial dance, connecting cosmic order to the Neoplatonic hierarchy emanating from the One. Her voice, calm and precise, carried an undercurrent of passion for the logos itself, the divine reason inherent in mathematics and the heavens. Her audience expanded beyond aspiring mathematicians. Young men, and remarkably, a few young women from families enlightened or bold enough to defy convention, sought her tutelage in philosophy. Hypatia's Neoplatonism wasn't esoteric mysticism divorced from the world. It was a rigorous framework for understanding existence. She taught that the path to virtue and communion with the divine lay through intellectual discipline and the purification of the soul. Mathematics was asceticism. Astronomy was contemplation. Her home, much like Theon's before it, became an extension of the Mausian, a salon where philosophy wasn't debated in the abstract, but lived. Students gathered not just for lectures, but for dialectic, the relentless Socratic questioning that honed thought and exposed fallacy. Hypatia presided with a serene authority, guiding discussions on Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, or Plotinus's Enneads, demanding logical rigor and intellectual honesty. She welcomed diverse viewpoints, fostering an environment where Christian students could engage with pagan thought, where the focus was on the pursuit of truth rather than adherence to dogma. This inclusivity, born of her philosophical conviction in the unity of knowledge and the primacy of reason, became a hallmark of her school. She remained unmarried, dedicating herself entirely to the life of the mind, embodying the Neoplatonic ideal of detachment from worldly distractions. Her personal austerity, simple dress, vegetarian diet, celibacy, wasn't affectation but a reflection of her commitment to inner purity and intellectual focus. Her reputation grew, transcending Alexandria. Letters arrived from scholars in Athens, Constantinople, and Anch, seeking her insights on astronomical observations, mathematical conundrums, or philosophical interpretations. She became known not as Theon's daughter, but as Hypatia the philosopher, a beacon of the Alexandrian tradition in an age where such lights were flickering. Yet, this very prominence placed her squarely in the gaze of forces less concerned with cosmic harmony than earthly power. The mantle of leadership settled upon Hypatia gradually, then decisively. As Theon aged, his physical presence within the Mausian diminished, though his influence remained through his writings and his daughter's stewardship. Upon his death, the transition felt less like a succession and more like the natural culmination of years of shared purpose. Hypatia became the acknowledged head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a position of immense intellectual prestige that carried, perhaps for the first time fully realized by its holder, profound political weight. The Serapeum was no longer the unchallenged heart of the city's life. Alexandria was a pressure cooker of competing identities. Pagan elites clinging to Hellenic traditions, a large and increasingly assertive Christian population, a significant Jewish community, imperial administrators, and volatile factions within each group. The prefect, appointed by the distant emperor in Constantinople, represented imperial authority and secular order. The Patriarch, leader of the Christian See of Alexandria, wielded immense spiritual and increasingly temporal power over his vast flock. The philosopher, especially one of Hypatia's stature, occupied a unique, perilous space. Her influence extended far beyond the lecture hall. Her reputation for wisdom, impartiality, and profound understanding of both classical thought and the workings of the natural world made her a sought-after counselor. Civic leaders, prominent merchants, and crucially, successive Roman prefects, sought her advice. She understood the complex machinery of the city, its aqueducts, its grain supply, its fractious population dynamics, through the lens of geometry, astronomy, and practical mechanics, but also through the ethical framework of philosophy. She could discuss the mathematics of water distribution with engineers, the astrological implications for harvests, still a practical concern, and the Stoic virtues of just governance with the prefect, all with the same grounded clarity. Her lack of overt political ambition or sectarian allegiance made her appear, to many, a neutral force grounded in reason, a living embodiment of the logos the city was founded upon. This placed her in a unique position to navigate the treacherous currents. When disputes arose between guilds or religious communities, Hypatia's mediation, rooted in fairness and logical persuasion rather than dogma, was often effective, at least for a time. Her most significant relationship was with Orestes, who became prefect of Alexandria around 412 AD. A complex figure, Orestes was a Christian, yet deeply educated in the classical tradition. He respected Hypatia immensely, valuing her intellectual rigor and her deep understanding of Alexandrian society. He frequently consulted her, not just on abstract philosophy, but on practical governance, seeing in her a compass in a city losing its bearings. To Orestes, Hypatia represented the rational, ordered Alexandria of Ptolemy and Euclid, a vision he sought to uphold against the rising tide of religious fervor. To Hypatia, Orestes represented the possibility of maintaining the civic space where reason could still flourish, a bulwark against the encroaching darkness of intolerance. Their bond, purely intellectual and advisory, would nonetheless become fatally entangled in the power struggle that was about to engulf the city. The Alexandria Hypatia navigated daily was a city straining at its seams. The grand Hellenic synthesis, once embodied by the Serapeum and the universal pursuit of knowledge, was fracturing under the weight of religious transformation. Christianity, no longer a persecuted sect but the state religion of the Roman Empire, was ascendant. Its triumph, however, was neither uniform nor peaceful. Alexandria became a battleground for competing orthodoxies, each claiming exclusive possession of truth. The Patriarch, a figure of immense power controlling vast wealth, and the loyalty of zealous monks and parabolani, a charitable brotherhood that increasingly functioned as the Patriarch's militia, often clashed violently with those deemed heretical, other Christian sects, pagans, and Jews. The pagan aristocracy, though diminished, clung fiercely to their heritage, their rituals, and the Serapeum as a symbol of their identity and intellectual tradition. The Jewish community, ancient and integral to Alexandria's commercial and intellectual life, found itself increasingly targeted and marginalized. The tension wasn't merely theological, it was deeply political. The Patriarch saw his authority as divinely ordained, encompassing not just spiritual matters but the moral and social life of the entire city. The prefect, representing the emperor, was charged with maintaining secular order, collecting taxes, and upholding imperial law, a law increasingly influenced by Christian doctrine but still requiring a degree of pluralism in a diverse metropolis. This inherent conflict simmered constantly. Hypatia, moving through these worlds, represented a third way, the realm of reason transcending sectarian divides. She taught Christians and pagans alike, respected by many devout Christians for her virtue and learning, even as others viewed her very existence as an affront, a prominent pagan woman wielding influence in a Christian empire. Her refusal to convert, her adherence to the philosophical path, and her advisory role to the prefect made her a symbol of the old order for those eager to see it swept away. The streets, once echoing with debates in Greek on metaphysics, now echoed with the chants of rival mobs. Processions could turn violent, insults hurled in markets could spark riots. The monks, often drawn from the impoverished and fanatical, roamed the streets as enforcers of the patriarch's will, a constant, intimidating presence. The air of free inquiry that had once permeated the city grew thin, replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and zealotry. Within the Serapeum's walls, Hypatia and her students maintained their focus on geometry, astronomy, and the ascent of the soul. But the sanctuary felt increasingly fragile, an island of logos in a rising sea of pistis, blind faith. The arrival of a new patriarch, Cyril, in 412 AD, would turn the simmering tension into a roaring blaze. Orestes, stepping into the volatile role of prefect, faced an almost impossible task. Alexandria demanded a ruler possessing both administrative acumen and the subtlety of a diplomat, capable of balancing imperial decrees, the patriarch's ambitions, the pride of the pagans, and the grievances of the Jews. He was a man of his time, a Christian by faith, yet his soul was deeply shaped by the classical paideia Hypatia embodied. He had been educated in rhetoric, law, and philosophy. He valued order, reason, and the established civic structures of the Roman world. In Hypatia, he found not just an advisor, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood Alexandria's complex soul and the principles of just governance rooted in ancient wisdom. Their consultations were frequent and substantive. She advised him on navigating the city's factions, understanding the underlying causes of unrest, and the practical applications of philosophy in statecraft. She might discuss Aristotle's politics concerning citizenship, or Stoic principles of duty and resilience in the face of adversity. Her insights into the city's infrastructure, derived from her grasp of mechanics and mathematics, were invaluable for managing the grain supply or the water systems, the very lifeblood of Alexandria. Orestes respected Hypatia's intellectual independence and her non-sectarian stance. He saw her as a stabilizing force, a representative of the city's enduring intellectual heritage that transcended religious squabbles. To Hypatia, Orestes represented the last, best hope for preserving the space where reason could operate, where the Mausian could continue its work, and where the diverse people of Alexandria could coexist under the rule of law, not religious fiat. She advised caution, dialogue, and adherence to established legal procedures, the very essence of the Roman civic ideal she cherished. Their relationship, though purely professional and intellectual, was misconstrued and weaponized by their enemies. To Patriarch Cyril, Orestes' reliance on Hypatia was an intolerable scandal. It symbolized the prefect's insufficient zeal, his dangerous attachment to pagan ways, and his resistance to the Church's absolute authority. Cyril saw Hypatia not as a philosopher, but as a pagan sorceress, using dark arts to bewitch the prefect and prevent the full Christianization of Alexandria. Rumors, insidious and baseless, began to circulate. Hypatia used astrological talismans to control Orestes. Her philosophical gatherings were covers for pagan rituals. Her influence was the sole obstacle to perfect harmony between the prefect and the patriarch. Orestes, for his part, found himself increasingly at odds with Cyril. He resisted the patriarch's attempts to interfere in secular jurisdiction, particularly concerning the Jewish community. He upheld the rights of pagan citizens, including Hypatia, to practice their beliefs within the bounds of the law, a stance Cyril viewed as heresy in itself. The stage was set for a direct, brutal confrontation, with Hypatia caught tragically in the middle, her very existence becoming a focal point for Cyril's wrath. Patriarch Cyril of Alexandria was a man of formidable intellect, iron will, and uncompromising ambition. Unlike his more diplomatic predecessor, Theophilus, Cyril saw his role not just as shepherd of his flock, but as the divinely appointed ruler of Alexandria, answerable only to God. His vision demanded complete submission to his theological authority, to his moral dictates, and ultimately, to his political control. Orestes' resistance, particularly his protection of the Jews and his association with Hypatia, was an affront to this divine mandate. Cyril moved swiftly and ruthlessly to consolidate power. He mobilized the Parabolani, transforming them from caregivers into a zealous political force. He inflamed the passions of the monks, many drawn from the lower classes and fiercely loyal to their charismatic patriarch, ready to enforce orthodoxy with violence. Cyril's rhetoric grew increasingly incendiary. Pagans were denounced as idolaters. Jews, historically tolerated but always vulnerable, were branded as Christ killers and enemies of the true faith. Hypatia became a particular target, the embodiment of the pagan intellectualism that Cyril sought to eradicate. Her influence over Orestes was portrayed as demonic, her philosophical teachings as a corrupting poison keeping the prefect from his Christian duty to submit to the church. The city became a tinderbox. Cyril orchestrated provocations. When Jewish communities, reacting to perceived threats or insults from Christians, retaliated, Cyril seized the opportunity. He demanded Orestes punish the Jews with extreme severity. Orestes, adhering to Roman law which required investigation and due process, refused to enact mass punishment without evidence. This refusal was painted by Cyril as proof of the prefect's corruption by Jewish gold and pagan witchcraft. Tensions exploded. Christian mobs, incited by Cyril's rhetoric and likely directed by his agents, launched a coordinated pogrom against the Jewish quarter. Synagogues were looted and burned, homes were destroyed, Jews were killed or driven from the city in terror. Orestes, horrified and furious, protested vehemently to Cyril and sent a detailed report to the Emperor Theodosius II in Constantinople, condemning the Patriarch's actions. Cyril responded with a mixture of brazen denial and counter-accusations, blaming the Jews for the violence. He also intensified the campaign against Hypatia. Pamphlets and street preachers spread lurid tales of her witchcraft, her satanic rituals disguised as philosophy, and her malign influence over the prefect. Her very presence in the city was declared a curse preventing God's favor. Orestes, attempting to assert his authority, was publicly attacked by a mob of monks. One monk, Ammonius, struck the prefect on the head with a stone, drawing blood. Orestes had Ammonius arrested and tortured to death, declaring him a criminal. Cyril, in a breathtaking act of defiance, promptly declared the murdered monk a martyr and saint, enshrining his relics. The rupture between the secular and religious authorities was now complete, absolute, and bathed in blood. Hypatia, continuing her lectures and her quiet life of study, represented everything Cyril despised and feared. In the fevered atmosphere he cultivated, her destruction became not just desirable, but necessary. In the wake of the expulsion of the Jews and the violent confrontation between Orestes and Cyril's monks, Alexandria descended into a state of nervous dread. The fragile civic fabric had been torn asunder. The streets felt different, emptier in some quarters, thick with hostile stares and whispered accusations in others. The Parabolani and the monks, emboldened by Cyril's sanctification of Ammonius, patrolled with an air of unchallengeable authority. The pagan elite retreated further into their homes and the relative sanctuary of the Serapeum, their confidence shattered. Orestes, though physically recovered from the attack, was politically wounded and isolated, his authority visibly diminished by Cyril's successful defiance. He continued his duties, but the shadow of the patriarch loomed over every decision. Within the Serapeum, the hum of scholarly activity continued, but it was now underscored by a palpable tension. Students glanced nervously towards the doors. The lofty ideals of Neoplatonic ascent felt increasingly distant, overshadowed by the crude realities of power and fanaticism outside. Hypatia felt the change acutely. Friends and former students, particularly those known to be Christian but who had valued her teaching, now avoided her, fearing association. The malicious rumors orchestrated by Cyril's faction grew louder, more grotesque. She was accused of using menstrual blood in rituals, of conjuring demons to control the prefect, of deliberately turning Orestes against Christ and his church. Her astronomical instruments were whispered to be tools of black magic. The very rationality she championed was twisted into evidence of diabolical pride. Yet, Hypatia refused to be cowed or to flee. To do so would be a betrayal of everything she stood for: the life of the mind, the courage of reason in the face of unreason, her duty to her students, and the legacy of the Mausian. She continued her lectures, her voice perhaps even steadier, her commitment to logos more resolute. She walked the streets between her home and the Serapeum with her characteristic dignified composure, a silent rebuke to the hysteria swirling around her. She likely advised Orestes still, urging steadfastness to law and principle, even as his room for maneuver vanished. Her home remained a haven for her closest students, the dialectic continuing, a fragile flame guarded against the gathering storm. But the pressure mounted relentlessly. Cyril, having broken Orestes' secular authority and driven out the Jews, needed a final, symbolic victory to cement his absolute control. He needed to eradicate the most visible symbol of the old Alexandria, the pagan intellectual whose influence persisted. Hypatia, the philosopher who dared to advise the prefect, who taught reason above revelation, who walked unafraid, became the inevitable target. The whispers coalesced into a single, venomous chant in the minds of the inflamed: Hypatia must be silenced. The shadow lengthened, touching the very steps of the lecture hall where she taught the harmony of the spheres, unaware that the celestial clockwork she so revered was counting down its final moments for her. The Lenten season of 415 AD arrived, a period traditionally marked by Christian fasting, prayer, and heightened religious fervor. Under Cyril's direction, this fervor was meticulously channeled into a weapon. The patriarch's sermons, delivered with fiery eloquence to vast, agitated crowds, took on a darker, more urgent tone. While avoiding explicit calls for violence, plausible deniability was crucial. Cyril masterfully stoked the embers of resentment and fear. He spoke of the city still polluted by the presence of the ungodly, of Satan's agents working tirelessly to undermine the faithful, of the urgent need for purification before the celebration of Christ's resurrection. He railed against the enemies of the church, the lingering pagans, the treacherous Jews. Though mostly expelled, their absence served as a reminder of victory, and those who consorted with them. Hypatia's name, though perhaps not always spoken directly from the pulpit, was invoked constantly through insinuation and coded language. The sorceress, the pagan enchantress, the corrupter of leaders, these epithets, seeded by Cyril's agents over months, now echoed through the streets, repeated by preachers in the markets and agitators among the parabolani and monks. Her image was grotesquely distorted in the public imagination, transformed from respected philosopher into a malevolent whose very existence blocked God's grace. The atmosphere became electric with pent-up aggression seeking an outlet. Cyril's inner circle, including the fiery preacher Peter the Reader, worked tirelessly to focus this aggression. Rumors flew. Hypatia was plotting with arrests to bring imperial troops against the Christians. She was performing blasphemous rites within the Serapeum. She held secret meetings to undermine the patriarch. The fact that she continued her public life, walking to the Serapeum, teaching her students, was portrayed as an act of brazen defiance against the Christian community and God himself. Her calm rationality became, in the fevered minds of the mob, proof of her demonic possession. The Lenten penitence mutated into a thirst for righteous violence, a purge that would cleanse the city. Orestes, isolated and powerless to curb Cyril's demagoguery, could only watch in despair. His reports to Constantinople seemed lost in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the distant court. He knew Hypatia was in grave danger, but any overt move to protect her would only confirm Cyril's accusations and likely trigger the very violence he feared. He may have sent discreet warnings, urging her to seek refuge or at least remain secluded. But Hypatia, true to her principles, refused to be driven into hiding by fear. To abandon her post, to cease her teaching, would be to surrender to the forces of unreason she had spent her life combating. She would meet the world with the dignity of philosophy, even if the world had gone mad. The city held its breath, the tension coiling like a spring. The threads of Alexandria's ancient tolerance and intellectual glory, already frayed to breaking, were about to snap completely. The target was chosen, the mob was primed. All that remained was the spark. The morning of March 415 AD dawned like any other over Alexandria. The Mediterranean light washed over the white city, gilding the colonnades and the great dome of the Caesareum. For Hypatia, the rhythms of scholarship held firm. If apprehension tightened her chest, it didn't show in her demeanor. There was work to do, knowledge to impart, the eternal truths of geometry and the heavens to contemplate. She prepared for her journey to the Serapeum, perhaps reviewing notes for her lecture, maybe on Apollonius of Perga's conic sections, their elegant curves mirroring celestial orbits, or perhaps on the ethical implications of Plato's Phaedo, the philosopher's preparation for death. Her household staff moved quietly, aware of the tension in the city but bound by loyalty and routine. The familiar streets felt different, emptier than usual, or perhaps thick with unseen watchers. The usual bustle seemed muted, replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by distant, indistinct shouts carried on the breeze. Within the Serapeum, the atmosphere among her students was taut. Fewer attended than in brighter days. Fear had kept many away. Those present were acutely aware of the danger surrounding their teacher. Yet, as Hypatia began to speak, her calm, logical voice weaving the threads of mathematical proof or philosophical argument, the sanctuary's ancient purpose reasserted itself. For a precious hour or two, the world outside receded. The focus was on the theorem, the celestial model, the nature of the soul's ascent. She spoke with her customary clarity and depth, her passion for the logos undimmed. Perhaps she emphasized the enduring nature of truth, the stability of mathematical principles amidst the chaos of human affairs. Perhaps she spoke of the Neoplatonic journey, the importance of inner fortitude, the detachment from the turmoil of the material world, the unwavering focus on the divine source of all reason. Her lecture was a final, powerful testament to the life she had chosen and the ideal she embodied. As the session concluded, the protective bubble of the lecture hall dissolved. The reality of the hostile city pressed back in. Students lingered, perhaps offering hesitant words of concern, urging caution. Hypatia acknowledged them with her characteristic quiet dignity, offering reassurance rooted in philosophical acceptance rather than false hope. She gathered her things, the scrolls and tablets that were the tools of her vocation. She prepared to walk back through the city streets, a journey that had become a daily act of defiance. She moved with her usual unhurried grace, a figure of intellectual serenity in a landscape increasingly dominated by blind fervor. She was returning home, not knowing it was the last time she would leave the Serapeum, the last time she would share the light of reason within its walls. The mob was already gathering, fueled by the toxic rhetoric of weeks and directed by Peter the Reader. They were waiting near the Caesareum, near her route. The lecture on conic sections, or the immortality of the soul, was over. The final, brutal lesson in the fragility of civilization was about to begin. Hypatia's journey homeward from the Serapeum that March afternoon took her along the familiar, sun-drenched streets towards the Bruchaean district. She likely walked, as was her custom, perhaps accompanied by a trusted servant or two, but without any armed escort. Such protection would have been alien to her life of the mind and might have been seen as provocation. The route probably took her past or near the imposing Caesareum, the temple dedicated to the imperial cult, now partially repurposed but still a prominent landmark. Unbeknownst to her, this was the chosen ground. Peter the Reader, acting as Cyril's chief enforcer and agitator, had mobilized a mob. Drawn from the ranks of the Parabolani and the most fanatical monks, inflamed by weeks of targeted rhetoric portraying Hypatia as the city's primary spiritual pollutant, they were primed for violence under the guise of religious zeal. The mob surged as Hypatia approached. There was no hesitation, no demand for explanation. They surrounded her litter or her small group on foot with terrifying speed, a wall of hatred and righteous fury. Gentlemen bystanders, perhaps some of her former students or simply citizens appalled by the unfolding atrocity, were shoved aside or threatened into silence. Reason had no place here. Only the raw energy of the pack remained. Within the sacred confines of the Caesarean church, or perhaps just outside its doors amidst the frenzied crowd, Hypatia's ordeal reached its horrific climax. The violence, thus far brutal and degrading, escalated into a frenzy of communal murder. The sources, though sparse and filtered through shock, speak of a horror beyond comprehension. Hypatia, already stripped, bleeding, and near unconscious from the stoning and the trauma of her public ordeal, was set upon by the mob with ostraca, oyster shells. These sharp, readily available fragments became instruments of torture and execution. The mob, driven by a collective bloodlust sanctified by Peter the Reader's presence and the perceived righteousness of their cause, tore her flesh apart. The act was not a swift killing, but a prolonged, savage dismemberment, a literal tearing limb from limb fueled by religious hysteria and the dehumanizing rhetoric that had transformed a philosopher into a demonic entity to be physically eradicated. Her body, what remained of it, was then subjected to a final act of symbolic annihilation. The murderous crowd, seeking to obliterate every trace of the woman who had embodied the old Alexandria, carried the mutilated remains to a place called Cineron. This location, likely a public square or open space used for burning refuse, served as a grim pyre. Her flesh and bones were burned, reduced to ashes scattered on the wind or mingled with the city's garbage. The intent was clear: complete eradication, not just of the life, but of the very memory, the physical essence, of Hypatia. No tomb, no relic, nothing to venerate or remember. She was to be erased. The immediate aftermath was a stunned silence, not of mourning, but of shock at the extremity of the act, even in a city grown accustomed to violence. The news radiated outwards like a tremor. Within the Serapeum, the heart of the scholarly world stopped. Students and fellow philosophers were paralyzed by horror and terror. The message was unambiguous: reason had no sanctuary. The life of the mind was extinguishable at the whim of the mob and the powers that directed it. Orestes, the prefect, received the news with profound shock and outrage. But his authority was utterly broken. To move against Cyril now, to attempt to arrest Peter the Reader or any participants, would be to invite open civil war and his own almost certain death. He could only protest impotently to Constantinople, his reports detailing the atrocity but lacking the power to enact justice. Cyril, when confronted, offered smooth denials. He condemned the violence in principle, expressing sorrow for the disorder, while carefully distancing himself and the Church from any responsibility. He blamed the spontaneous fury of the people, perhaps subtly implying Hypatia's own conduct had provoked it. The murder, he suggested, was a regrettable tragedy, but not an act sanctioned by the Church. The careful veil of plausible deniability held. The light of Alexandria's greatest mind had been brutally snuffed out, and the city, under the shadow of the Patriarch, began the grim process of absorbing this new, terrifying reality. The brutal murder of Hypatia cast a long, chilling silence over Alexandria. The initial shockwaves of horror subsided into a pervasive atmosphere of fear and resignation. For the pagan community and the intellectual circles centered on the Serapeum, it was a devastating blow, a clear signal that their world was ending. Scholars who had once debated the nature of the soul now feared for their own lives. Many began making quiet plans to leave, seeking refuge in Athens, which still maintained its philosophical schools, or further afield. The vibrant dialectic within the Mausian faltered, replaced by hushed conversations and wary glances. The shelves of scrolls seemed less like repositories of wisdom and more like relics of a condemned past. Orestes, the prefect, was a broken man. Hypatia's murder was the final demonstration of his impotence. His reports to Emperor Theodosius II in Constantinople, detailing the atrocity and Cyril's clear instigation, resulted in nothing substantial. Cyril was too powerful, too cunning, and too essential to imperial stability in the volatile East. An imperial commission of inquiry was eventually sent, but Cyril, a master politician, skillfully deflected blame, portraying the murder as an unfortunate outburst by an uncontrollable mob. He may have made minor concessions, perhaps agreeing to slightly curb the Parabolani's political activities, a curb quickly ignored, but he faced no real sanction. Peter the Reader vanished from Alexandria for a time, a temporary exile that served as a token gesture. Orestes, his position untenable and his spirit crushed, likely requested a transfer or simply faded from his post, leaving Alexandria not long after. The secular arm of imperial authority in the city had been effectively amputated. Cyril emerged from the crisis stronger than ever. He had eliminated his most potent symbolic rival, demonstrated his absolute control over the city's streets and populace, and humiliated the imperial prefect with impunity. His power was now unchallenged. The Christian community, largely unaware of or willing to overlook the patriarch's machinations, rallied around him. Hypatia's elimination was spun, implicitly, as a necessary cleansing for the city's spiritual health. The silence that fell over the pagan and intellectual communities was interpreted by Cyril's followers as a sign of divine favor and the triumph of true faith over pagan deception. Within the Serapeum, the silence was the silence of a dying institution. Theon's legacy, carried by his daughter, had been extinguished. The flow of students dwindled to a trickle. The great minds who remained worked in isolation, their voices muted, their purpose eroded. The grand project of the library and Mausian, the centuries-long accumulation and pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, was breathing its last. The murder of Hypatia hadn't just killed a philosopher. It had severed the vital thread connecting Alexandria to its founding intellectual ideal. The sanctuary of Logos was empty, its guardian scattered or silenced, its light dimmed. The stones of the Serapeum stood, but the spirit within had been dealt a mortal wound. The final blow, the physical destruction of the temple and its remaining treasures, was now only a matter of time and pretext. The Serapeum, once a bustling sanctuary of intellect, lingered as a spectral presence in the years following Hypatia's murder. Its great halls echoed with the footsteps of a dwindling few. The scholars who remained were ghosts of the past, tending to the dying embers of a fire that had illuminated the ancient world. Scrolls were still consulted, lectures occasionally given to sparse audiences, but the vital energy, the sense of being at the forefront of human understanding, was gone. The atmosphere was one of quiet custodianship, a desperate holding action against the inevitable. The pagan rituals continued within the temple precincts, but they felt like defiant gestures rather than living faith, performed under the hostile gaze of a city now dominated by Cyril's uncompromising Christianity. The Serapeum had become an anachronism, a monument to a defeated ideal, and Cyril viewed its continued existence as an affront. The pretext for its final destruction came, as such pretexts often do, from a minor incident magnified into an existential threat. Historical accounts are murky, but around 391 AD, though some argue for a later date, perhaps even post-Hypatia, tensions flared. A rumor spread, perhaps a discovered pagan ritual deemed blasphemous, a perceived insult by pagans against Christians, or simply a staged provocation. Cyril, or his predecessor Theophilus, seized the opportunity. The Patriarch declared the Serapeum a den of idolatry and demonic influence, a poison at the heart of the Christian city. He called upon the faithful to cleanse Alexandria of this abomination. Mobs, likely including the Parabolani and monks, surged towards the temple complex. Imperial troops, either complicit or unwilling to intervene against the Patriarch's will and the popular frenzy, stood aside. The pagans, including some philosophers and remaining priests, attempted a defense. They barricaded themselves within the massive structure, but their resistance was hopeless against the sheer numbers and fervor of the attackers. The assault was brutal and thorough. The great doors were battered down. Statues of Serapis and other deities, including the colossal cult statue of Serapis himself, were toppled, smashed, and dragged through the streets. Sacred objects were looted or destroyed. The altars were desecrated. The library annexes, the repositories of centuries of accumulated knowledge, were not spared. Scrolls and codices, the works of generations of thinkers, were torn from their shelves. Some were burned in great pyres in the streets, the smoke carrying the ashes of Euclid, Herophilus, and countless countless others over the city. Others were looted, discarded, or simply left to rot. The destruction was not merely of objects, but of the idea the Serapeum represented. The belief that knowledge from all sources, pagan or otherwise, was valuable, that understanding the natural world through reason was a sacred pursuit. The physical structure itself was significantly damaged, later repurposed as a Christian church dedicated to the cult of martyrs like Saint John the Baptist, a bitter irony. With the destruction of the Serapeum, the Mausian, the scholarly institution, effectively ceased to exist. The last philosophers fled, taking fragments of knowledge with them to Athens, Constantinople, or Persia. The Great Library of Alexandria, its spirit already fading for centuries, breathed its last, definitive breath. The center of the intellectual universe shifted elsewhere, leaving Alexandria a city of faith triumphant, but reason vanquished. The twilight had deepened into night. The ashes of the Serapeum settled. The pyres that consumed Hypatia's body and countless scrolls smoldered out. Alexandria, under the firm grip of Patriarch Cyril, who would later be declared a doctor of the Church, entered a new phase, one defined by Christian orthodoxy, ecclesiastical power, and the fading memory of its pagan past. The vibrant, disputatious, intellectually daring city of Ptolemy and Euclid was gone, replaced by a center of theological authority. Cyril reigned supreme until his death in 444 AD, his power unchallenged, his legacy cemented within the Church. The philosophers were scattered, the great tradition of the Mausian fractured and dispersed. Some knowledge survived the exodus. Neoplatonic thought found refuge in Athens for another century until Justinian closed the academy in 529 AD, and later in the Islamic world, where Greek texts were preserved, translated, and built upon. But the unique Alexandrian synthesis, the fusion of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, and philosophy within a single, vibrant institution, was irrevocably lost. Hypatia herself seemed destined for oblivion, consumed by the violence Cyril so deftly managed. Her name was omitted from official histories. Her works, commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius, astronomical tables, perhaps philosophical treatises, were lost, likely destroyed in the Serapeum's sacking or deliberately suppressed. Yet, paradoxically, the manner of her death ensured her survival, not as a scholar, but as a symbol. Christian chroniclers like Socrates Scholasticus, writing just a few decades later, recorded her murder with palpable horror, condemning the atrocity and implicitly criticizing Cyril's faction, preserving the basic facts of her life and brutal end. Pagan contemporaries mourned her as the last great light of their world. Over centuries, her story transformed. In the Enlightenment, she was resurrected as a martyr for reason and science against religious fanaticism. Voltaire championed her. Gibbon recounted her fate as emblematic of the triumph of superstition. Painters depicted her serene beauty amidst the violence. In the modern era, she became an icon for feminists, a woman of towering intellect destroyed by patriarchal violence. The historical Hypatia, the mathematician, the astronomer, the Neoplatonist philosopher, remains elusive, her voice silenced. But the idea of Hypatia endures powerfully. She represents the fragile beauty of rational inquiry, the courage of intellectual independence, and the profound loss when dogma extinguishes dialogue. She embodies the cost paid when the pursuit of understanding yields to the certainty of belief. The Library of Alexandria, and Hypatia with it, passed into legend, a symbol of vanished grandeur and the vulnerability of knowledge. Its destruction became a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization, a reminder that the accumulated wisdom of centuries can be scattered by the winds of intolerance in a terrifyingly short time. The loss was incalculable. Works of literature, history, science, and philosophy unique to its collection vanished forever, leaving gaps in our understanding of the ancient world that can never be filled. Yet, the aspiration the library represented, the universal gathering of knowledge, the belief that understanding the world and our place within it is humanity's highest calling, never truly died. It echoes in every university, every research institution, every effort to preserve and share human understanding across boundaries. Hypatia's journey from the quiet contemplation of celestial mechanics to the bloody stones of the Caesarean is a stark reminder of the darkness that can descend when reason is abandoned. But her enduring legacy, etched not in scrolls but in the human yearning for light, whispers that the logos she served cannot be entirely extinguished. The last light of Alexandria was brutally put out, but its echo continues to illuminate the long path of human thought, a flickering, persistent reminder of what was lost and what we must strive to protect. The stones of the Serapeum may have been repurposed, but the dream it housed, the dream of a world understood through reason, still lingers in the dust, waiting to be rediscovered.